What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Explain It to Me. It's been like 3 weeks since we've done any of these, ever since Loki ended. But
haven't had anything to explain.
Yeah. But yeah, we're going to talk about one picture today. But this is the Lord of the Rings show is basically the reason I wanted to start doing this, because Ashton knows a lot about a lot of things, but I don't know anyone that knows more about Tolkien and Lord of the Rings than Ashton does. So I'm excited to do this. Our first Lord of the Rings episode of hopefully many. But I guess we should go through and talk about all of our various knowledge levels. Molly, where would you say you are with Lord of the Rings?
Pretty low. I enjoy Lord of the Rings a lot. I've never read the books. I love the movies. Hobbit movies are meh. Okay, sure. But yeah, no, my knowledge is very, very small.
Surface level, like our level of knowledge for Marvel, I guess. Whatever the movies tell us, that's what we know. I'm a little bit above that. I've read the books, the Lord of the Rings books, multiple times. I've read The Hobbit multiple times and loved them. I've read the Silmarillion once. I've attempted to read it like 3 times. That's a very different book. So I saw some people speculating, David, that like, I know a lot about the movies. I know a decent amount about Lord of the Rings as far as the books and the movies go. But when you start to get into the Second Age and the stuff that this show is going to cover, I'm pretty much at a loss. I know some very, very basics from the Silmarillion. But Ashton, where would you say your knowledge level lies?
So it's kind of my favorite fandom. So I I guess I know a lot about it, and I've played, like, you know, whenever they've come out with games, unless they were ridiculously terrible as far as the story goes, which we've talked about before.
Ashton hates Shelob, the sexy spider lady.
So dumb.
We need to do an episode just about that game.
It's just that there's so many things in the story that they could have made a really cool game about, and instead they made up a bunch of stuff that doesn't make any sense. Anyway, we're not going to talk about that. But yeah, no, my fandom with Lord of the Rings all started when I was in high school, I guess, because it was kind of how I discovered that I enjoyed reading, was because one of my friends was like, hey, let's go see this Fellowship of the Ring movie. It's like, because I was playing EverQuest at the time, and he was like, it's like sort of like EverQuest and stuff. And so we went and watched it, and I loved it. And so then we were leaving, and he was like, oh yeah, you know, there's like this character Tom Bombadil that wasn't even in the movie, and there's all this stuff that happens that's different in the books. You should read them. So then I read all of the books and like the Silmarillion and everything before Two Towers came out. And then I've reread them a bunch of times. So
that's, yeah, we got into Lord of the Rings right at the same time. It was when the movies were coming out, and my dad, again, he got me into Star Wars, and he has, and I have him back there now. He gave them to me like some second edition versions of the books, and so he read The Hobbit to me growing up. I read Fellowship, I think, before the Fellowship movie came out. Then yeah, I just read the rest of them, and I think Lord of the Rings took over Star Wars as my favorite fandom for a while there in high school. But it came back around to Star Wars for me. It was a fun time when like Attack of the Clones and Two Towers were coming out in the same year, and Christopher Lee was in both.
Yeah,
it was some great stuff.
When it was like growing up, all the books that I had to read, it was because school was making me, you know, they were like, oh, you have to read this book and then do a book report or whatever. And I just didn't like them, you know? And then when I got to, when I read Lord of the Rings, that was one of the first like serious books that I read for fun. And I actually enjoyed it a lot, which kind of kindled a love for, you know, fantasy and sci-fi fiction ever since. So
I remember getting the reading list for, I think, 10th grade. And it said Lord of the, and I was like, and it was flies. And I was like, damn it. Oh, God, we were so close.
I think somehow one year, like when I was reading Lord of the Rings for the first time, I somehow convinced my teachers to let one of those be one of my summer reading books.
Okay, well, let's bring up the image. We got our first look at the Lord of the Rings show that is going to come out in just over a year. I think it's Labor Day 2022. Which is frustrating as DragonCon people. We'll have to figure that out. But here's the first image. and I'm just gonna let Ashton go, and we're just gonna try to keep up. So, what about this picture got you most excited?
So I mean, I saw that picture and I was like, oh, this is a cool picture. And then when I noticed the trees in the background, that's when I was like, oh shit.
Oh dang, it's going down.
Because I did not expect that at all.
Okay, so and I saw a lot of people freaking out about the trees, and that's something I remember as a concept in the Silmarillion, and that's it. I couldn't tell you anything about them. So, what are the trees?
So the trees are extremely important for the story and the mythology of Arda and Middle Earth. Basically, to go through it very briefly, when the world was new and the gods were shaping it, there wasn't any light besides the stars. And then when the elves wake up, they see the stars, and that's like the first word that they invent is the Elvish word for stars, and they are like they always love stars because of that. But soon Melkor decides to be extra evil and starts sending like all these things and terrorizing the elves in the darkness where they can't really see all that well. So eventually the Valar, who are like the gods, are like, we gotta, shed some light on this world so that people can, see things. So so they create these gigantic lamps that are just on these big giant like towers that light the whole world. And then Melkor, being evil, just goes and kicks him over basically and wrecks a bunch of shit. And so then the gods are like, well, we should have probably seen that coming, but they have to repair everything. And then their next solution is that the goddess of nature creates the two trees. And this is vastly oversimplifying things and skipping over a lot. But she creates these two trees which give off light, and it kind of waxes and wanes in like a day-night cycle, where it gets brighter and then gets dimmer, one tree gets brighter, and then as it's dimming, the other tree gets brighter. And so they kind of trade off, but there's kind of a twilight period where they're both only half lit.
And you can kind of see that here, I guess.
Yeah.
Where one tree looks brighter.
Mm-hmm. And then that light sort of shines over the entire world, because at that point in time, just physically making it make sense, at that point in time, Arda, which is the world that Middle Earth is in, was basically a flat world. It wasn't actually round, which kind of makes it make sense that they could shine light over the whole world, not to mention that it's kind of like mythology and stuff, so it's magic. But anyway, that's why they're really important, because they were like the thing that lit the world before the sun and the moon existed.
So what about them gave you like that oh shit reaction? Just the fact that they're including stuff like that? Or
well, for one thing, so up until this image was released, the consensus seemed to be that Amazon had licensing for the second age specifically of the Silmarillion, or of Middle Earth and stuff. But the trees are long gone by the second age. So this has to be either it's a flashback. I mean, I'm assuming it's a flashback, or like a prologue or something. Because this is definitely not the second age. When it first came out, a lot of people were like, oh, this has got to be Numenor, and it's just like the sun's behind them. The trees aren't actually lit up, but it's not. That's almost certain.
Yeah, why would that?
Valinor.
That seems like
only
why would they
plebeians
include
think
that?
Yeah, that's almost certainly Valinor. So, yeah. Specifically, Tyrion is the.
Do you think they could do something kind of like the way Lord of the Rings kicks off with the prologue, which is the end of the second age, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's the end and then the beginning of the third age.
So could they do something like that where they show us the first age and like a little prologue for this show?
Well, so the trees are actually pre-first age. They're from like the first age began when the sun and the moon were created. And this is, well before that. So
it's like the zero age.
Yeah, there's like
prehistory.
There's a very, very long period of time before they started like the first age, where there was like the time before there were the lights, and then there were the age of the lamps, I think they call it, and then the age of the trees, and then the first age starts when they because the trees get destroyed by Melkor or Morgoth, and then they take fruit from the 2 trees and create the sun and the moon out of those.
Very mythological. That's cool.
Yeah, and also the light of those 2 trees gets captured in the Silmarils, which are what the Silmarillion's named after, which are the 3 gems that Feanor creates that are just the most important things in the history of Arda, pretty much. And so the trees give rise to the Silmarils, and then when Melkor destroys the trees, the gods are like, hey, can we use your Silmarils to rekindle the trees? And he won't give them up because it would destroy them. And it's like a huge moment in the history of the Lord of the Rings universe.
So this show, if it's going to take place in the Second Age, what would you say is going to be the story of it? The basic thing we're going to follow, or just what happens in the Second Age?
So the Second Age is it starts with the changing of the world at the end of the war between Morgoth and the Noldor, and then the Valar, when they take Morgoth and exile him.
And Morgoth is like a fallen angel.
Morgoth is
God, kinda?
the god, is like the evil god. Like
Right.
He's the guy that was Sauron's boss, pretty
Boss.
much. So he's like the biggest bad of the Lord of the Rings mythos. And at the end of the First Age, he had stolen the Silmarils from Feanor and then gone and hid in his fortress. And so then when the gods finally showed up to help, they, beat Morgoth's armies and take him prisoner and then exile him into the void. And that's when the Second Age begins. Because also in the process of that war happening, the whole world gets changed. A large section of the continent called Beleriand was sunk under the ocean, and then they create an island for the people that would later become the Numenorians, which is where Numenor is.
Okay. And what are the Noldor?
The Noldor are the are a subsection of elves. They're a certain type of elf, sort of like the Sindar are another kind of elf.
Okay.
But the Noldor are elves that went to the Undying Lands when the Valar first found them. They brought some of the elves back to Valinor, but some of them stayed behind. Like the ancestors of like Legolas, for example, stayed behind and never went. But the Noldor are some of the elves that did go, and then they followed Feanor back. Most of the Noldor followed Feanor back to Middle Earth to try to get the Silmarils back. And in the process, they kind of disobeyed the gods and were sort of cursed because of that. Also, they killed some other elves in the process, which was the first kinslaying, where the elves actually killed other elves. So, yeah, they were... It was because they swore an oath to get the Silmarils back no matter what it took. And so they didn't want to kill other elves, but they had sworn that oath, and in order to keep their oath, they had to. And so they did.
So I'm going to bring this up because that's just like a question that my only question really, other than what are the trees, is who is that person? And I assume they're not Krennic.
Yeah, that's everyone's making that
Krennic. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people that it could be. I mean, it's if I had to guess, I would guess that it might be Sauron.
Ooh.
I like that.
Because I think since the story takes place in the Second Age, and we know that it's going to involve Numenor a lot because of some of the like map teaser things that they released a while back. Sauron's going to be a pivotal character in the show. And he didn't always look like a big spiky bad guy, before he was corrupted by Morgoth, he was a servant of Eule, the smith god, and lived in Valinor. So, I mean, by this time, I think he was already corrupted, but he was frequently taking like a fair image and trying to look like a good guy. So and he is kind of like whoever, or he or she, whoever this is standing in this field by themselves. So, you know, it could be Sauron kind of like looking at Valinor, having already, you know, been corrupted, and looking at like, you know, what he could have been. I don't know.
I'm pretty proud of myself because I kind of got the same vibe. I was like, I wonder if that's Sauron kind of looking at what he's about to go, just like prepping up to go mess everything up.
Yeah.
He's basically doing what every cat does every day. Like,
Well,
look at all of this that I'm going to destroy.
Ruin all of this.
Well, and his whole shtick as of the Second Age is disguising himself as a good guy and someone who's here to help. And so that would very much be in line with, you know, that depiction of him in this picture, if that's in fact Sauron.
Real quick, Rick Villanueva, thanks so much for the super chat. I haven't looked, but are there audiobooks for the early Lord of the Rings stories? I tried reading the trilogy and The Hobbit in my teens, and page turners they were not, in my opinion. I still love the lore, though. Tolkien is so weird, in my opinion. Like that, just because every book seems so different. Like The Hobbit is very much a children's story, and Lord of the Rings is very, I don't even know how to, high fantasy, I guess. I still love the Lord of the Rings books. And then you get to freaking Silmarillion, the history book.
Yeah, Silmarillion is basically a textbook. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
I don't know. I don't know if there are any audiobooks. I assume there are.
Yeah, because
Ashton,
like,
have you ever listened to any of them?
I haven't listened to any of the audiobooks, but I'm pretty sure there's good ones out there.
I mean, are there books out there that are like the Silmarillion but condensed? Like, has anyone taken these stories and like the history of Lord of the Rings and kind of like condensed it and done?
Well, the Silmarillion is already extremely condensed. Like, it's like a textbook where it's a textbook in that it'll be like, and then there was a war, and so won. Moving on, you know,
like the last couple pages are like, and then Sauron made some rings, and he made this one ring, and some hobbits destroyed it. The end.
Yeah, like the entirety of the Lord of the Rings story is in the Silmarillion, and it takes place over a span of like 4 pages or something. So yeah, it's pretty condensed. There are some sections where they've done the opposite of that, and they've made books out of an individual story that's very, you know, quickly gone through in the Silmarillion. Like Children of Hurin is one that they made into a book. I'm pretty sure there's a Fall of Gondolin book also. I haven't read that one though. So
I was going to ask if you've read like all of Tolkien's works, or
there's some that I haven't read, because there's some books that are like based on notes that he wrote, and they're specifically contradictory to the Silmarillion. Like there's things where it's like, this is a version of this story that he wrote and decided that he didn't like as much as this other version. And you can find that in a book, but I kind of tend to stay away from those because I don't want to confuse myself with the things that are actually like part of the actual canon.
This is cool. I didn't know BBC adaptation.
I've never heard of that either.
There's a Russian one too that videos have been going around of lately that's from like the 80s, and it's awful and hilarious.
Rick also asks, what would you recommend reading before getting into this series? It's probably the Silmarillion, but
yeah, I mean the Silmarillion would be the best thing to read if you want to know what's going to be going on in this show. I mean, granted, it's a pretty dry reading, but my recommendation, if you're trying to read the Silmarillion, though, is just to, like, if you start getting confused, just kind of keep going, and it'll probably make sense eventually.
Power through.
And if certain sections of it didn't make sense, that's okay. You know, it doesn't, like the beginning of it is usually the part that throws people because it is kind of confusing. It's very abstract, like the first section of the book, with the creation story, and it's really easy to get confused. Like the first time I read it, I got pretty confused because it almost seems like they're telling the creation story twice, but it's actually not. It's like an abstract, here's the gods doing god things before the world even existed, and then here's them actually creating the world, and it's two different stories. So all that to say, if you start getting confused, just keep at it. It'll make sense eventually.
I feel like the Silmarillion trained me to read things like Game of Thrones or the High Republic. Like a lot of people are saying, the High Republic has so many names and I can't keep up with them all. And I'm like, you know what? I think I just learned how to power through and be like, you know what? If this person's important, they'll come up again. I'll remember the name, whatever. Like, I'm just going to keep going. I feel like that the Silmarillion is what did that to me.
Yeah.
Oh, apparently the Children of Hurin audiobook is read by Christopher Lee. That's cool.
Oh, cool.
I love how much of a like Tolkien nerd he was.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, and Tolkien, he like had spoken to Tolkien a few times, and Tolkien had always said that if they made a Lord of the Rings book, he wanted Christopher Lee to play Gandalf. And so like that's what Christopher Lee wanted when they started doing those movies, but he was just a little bit too old, and Gandalf has to do a little bit too much action, you know? And so they ended up casting, Ian McKellen as Gandalf, but they still got Christopher Lee to do Saruman.
Which I think he's amazing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's great casting.
Well, and he had like, I've heard all the time about him like doing yearly rereads of Lord of the Rings, and so he was like kind of their resident expert on set apparently. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. I remember hearing that like he would just tell stories on set, and like everyone would just like sit around and listen to him talk about the history of Lord of the Rings, and that would have been so cool.
Mm-hmm.
So could we? This is a good question too. Will we see Gandalf or any of the other wizards in the Second Age?
Well, so the wizards, the wizards are not sent to Middle Earth until the Third Age.
Okay,
but prior to being sent to Middle Earth, they are Maiar. They are in the Undying Lands. I mean, Gandalf could be hanging out in the trees in this picture. That could be Gandalf in the picture. Who knows?
Because he could look like anything at that point.
Yeah. So his name before he became one of the Astari, it was Alurin, and he was. I mean, that's probably not Gandalf, but
Finally,
yeah, at long last.
Well, I've seen people like thinking that maybe that was Galadriel, and like we're gonna see Galadriel when she was young, so she would be around.
That is possible. Galadriel is one of the only like named character elves in the Lord of the Rings period of time who was around, prior to the First Age in the Undying Lands, and saw the trees. And it's kind of a big deal because for elves, if they saw the trees, like if they were that close to them, then they were imbued with the sort of strength and power and like spiritual strength.
Oh, it's like Superman in the sun.
Makes them kind of a big deal. Yeah, exactly. So like Galadriel and Glorfindel and I think Gildor are like some of the only characters that are named in the Lord of the Rings that would have been around at that point in time.
Who do you think is going to be like the main character if you had to just take a complete shot in the dark, because you basically are? But
yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because it's such a broad period of time that the story can take place in. Like, we don't really know what it's going to be about. I'm guessing that it's probably going to be an ancestor of Elendil and Isildur in Numenor. That's going to probably be the primary character, and it's going to be about them.
Kind of tie it into Aragorn too.
Yeah, and them being kind of like in the Numenorian kingdom, watching it become corrupt as Sauron sort of influences the king. I think that's probably going to be.
Wait, how is it? Back up. How is it connected to Aragorn?
So Aragorn's ancestors were from Numenor, which is kind of like Atlantis in Lord of the Rings. Okay. So it was an island that the gods created in the middle of the ocean between the Undying Lands, which humans were forbidden from going to, and Middle Earth. And so they were allowed to get in their boats and sail over to Middle Earth, and they could go to Numenor, but they couldn't go west to the Undying Lands. That was forbidden.
What would happen if they tried?
well, they do try, spoilers, at one point, and it's like an act of war against the gods, basically, and that's when Numenor is destroyed completely.
Okay.
Oopsies. Yeah.
But yeah, and they can actually see Numenor some of the time, or they can see the Undying Lands from Numenor sometimes because they're that close to them, but they're not allowed to go there.
I did see this in the chat. I think they have cast these people because we've seen casting rumors. But
Yeah.
Alex, you looked this up earlier, and we didn't see anything.
IMDb doesn't have anyone listed as their character. It has plenty of people that have been cast in the show, but no one is listed as playing Galadriel or playing one specific.
I could see that. I mean, Galadriel was an important character, like all along. You know, from the point when, like, I want to say the first time that she's brought up is when Feanor creates the Silmarils, and he asks Galadriel for a lock of her hair, and she won't give it to him, because she doesn't trust him because he's kind of sinister, or she sensed that about him, which most other people didn't. He's kind of like, he's like the most famous elf that was ever born, and he's like one of the most talented elf craftsmen that was ever born, and he creates these amazing items, and everybody's like, oh, Feanor's kind of a big deal, but then Feanor's kind of a jerk to everybody. And so Galadriel kind of like sensed that about him and cut through the nonsense and was like, no, I don't like this guy. And he liked her and asked her for a lock of her hair, and she refused him, which ends up being kind of a big poetic big deal when she gives Gimli,
I was going to bring that up.
of her hair. Mm-hmm.
Huh. I also saw that. I'm gonna have to look into this BBC adaptation. This sounds really cool. A 26-hour.
Oh, I think I do remember
radio.
hearing about that.
Mm-hmm. I did hear about that. Yeah.
I remember Ian Holm playing Frodo.
Yeah.
A couple of people saying it's really good.
But yeah, so Galadriel's kind of a big deal. She's part of the host that followed, even though she didn't like Feanor, she did follow his group back to Middle Earth because effectively Galadriel's whole story is kind of a constant battle between her ambition and her wisdom. And so she has this ambition that she wants to become a lord and like a big deal and be someone that's important. And the way that she tries to do that is to go to Middle Earth. She doesn't really care about what Feanor is doing all that much, but she wants to go back to Middle Earth because there's the opportunity for her to be someone important and do important things. And so she does that and goes back to Middle Earth. And then there's a whole slew of things that happen with her story where she doesn't become a lord for a very long time. And then eventually she becomes the Lady of Lothlorien and is that, you know, big deal kind of person that she was wanting to be. And that's why she has that scene with Frodo where she has the opportunity to take the ring, and that would be furthering her ambition goal, but her wisdom wins out in the end. And so that's why she says, I've passed the test. I'll remain Galadriel and go into the West. That's
interesting that, yeah, seeing this show could give a lot of extra context to stuff like that happens in Lord of the Rings. And I think I was a little bit confused, even having read Fellowship of the Ring. I was just like, I don't understand really why it was such a big deal for her to almost get the ring or be offered it and turn it down.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, it's like the culmination of this whole, like, you know, story arc that exists only really in the Silmarillion, and you don't get it in Lord of the Rings necessarily.
Yeah.
But yeah, like there's stuff like that. Gandalf, on the other hand, doesn't really have any storyline before he's chosen as one of the Astari. But we do know that he's a Maiar that was like well regarded by the Valar. Like they initially wanted him to be the head of the Astari. Like they wanted him to be the leader. But they ended up deciding to make Curanir, which becomes Saruman, the leader instead, for reasons I can't remember exactly why, but Gandalf is kind of like secretly told, like, yeah, that guy's in charge, but keep an eye on him, you know, because they recognized that he was the wisest of the wizards that they sent.
Was there any Valar that when Saruman fell was going around like, I told you so. I told you it should have been Gandalf.
It was probably just them telling. It was probably Manwë saying that to Aule, because Manwë was the one that liked Gandalf, and even though he wasn't one of Manwë's servants, Manwë being the guy who's also in charge of the Eagles. So, that kind of makes sense that Gandalf had that sort of kinship with the Eagles later. But yeah, and Saruman was a servant of Aule, the smith god, which leads into his whole love of machinery and artifice, later on.
I've seen people talking about this, not just in the chat, but in general, that it doesn't sound like Amazon has the rights to the Silmarillion. I don't know what they have the rights to or how that's going to affect the story, because like it is weird that, Lord of the Rings is part of the Silmarillion technically. So
from what I've heard and what I've seen in articles about this, they have licensing rights to certain parts of the Silmarillion, but not the entirety of the Silmarillion, whatever that means. So,
okay.
Yeah. I don't know. We'll see.
All right.
I do think that they chose the Second Age for a reason, and that's that there's a lot of like gray area in the Second Age where we don't have very, very specific stories already set out. So they have as blank a canvas as you could hope for, other than setting it after Lord of the Rings. This is probably one of the more open time periods to set a story and be able to do what you want with it.
So it starts, the Second Age starts with the ending of that war, and then it ends with the last alliance of men and elves.
Yeah, so the Second Age begins with the creation of Numenor, and it ends with the ring being cut from Sauron's hand at the last alliance. So that's a pretty broad time period. That's like the entirety of the existence of Numenor as a kingdom.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense to me that it would be about Sauron and the rings, just to tie it pretty closely back to Lord of the Rings. So it might be at the tail end of the Second Age, or maybe it would do like each season covers one big event and then it jumps. Because I mean, they're elves and they're men that live forever. So like,
well, and it covers a lot of Sauron's backstory too, because as of the beginning of the Second Age, Sauron is in hiding because they just captured his boss and threw him into outer space basically, and he's just like, and so he's hiding, in Middle Earth and just kind of laying low for a while, and then eventually he shows back up as Anatar and teaches the elves in Eregion how to make. Or Region, I don't know how to pronounce it exactly. I've just read it a lot. He teaches them how to make rings of power, specifically Celebrimbor. And that's another place that Galadriel might come in, because she's the one that convinces Celebrimbor to create the 3 elven rings in secret and not share it with Anatar. So, I mean, and Celebrimbor is a close friend of Galadriel, which is why he gives her one of the rings.
Yeah.
Like the idea that they could also, because even still, I feel like I've asked you 100 times to be like, okay, I basically get the way the One Ring works, but just say it again. And so like they could use this show as kind of a way to explain and really lay out, here are the rings of power, and here's what the One Ring does and why it's so bad.
Yeah, well, and especially because this would give us an opportunity to see beyond just what we see in the prologue, to see what Sauron does with the One Ring, because that's what its intended purpose was what Sauron does with it. So, that would be really interesting to see, because in like Lord of the Rings, Sauron has it in the prologue, and it's just like, oh, he's a big bad spiky dude with a giant mace, but we don't really get to see what the big deal with this ring is when Sauron has it, whereas we would potentially get to see that in the show. It's unlike I think it's a little bit unlikely that we'll see him much with the One Ring, because if it is set in Numenor while Sauron is a captive there, he doesn't have the One Ring with him.
Right.
Because he willingly went into captivity so that he could corrupt them, basically.
Is that before the One Ring existed?
Well, no, he had made the One Ring. He had made the One Ring, but he didn't wear it when he went to Numenor, because he was like feigning weakness, basically. Like Numenor had this massive army, and they were like, oh, this Sauron guy in Mordor is a is bad news. So we need to go deal with him. So they landed this huge army and marched to Mordor and demanded that Sauron face them in battle. Sauron recognized that he wasn't strong enough to actually beat them yet. So he left the ring at home and went before the king of Numenor and was like, "You got me, I surrender." And so they took him prisoner back to Numenor, which was a huge mistake, because then he, as all these generations of kings go by, because even though they have longer lives than normal humans, they still are humans. They don't live forever. And so it's generation after generation of kings, while Sauron is still the same Sauron sitting there in prison in Numenor, and he has all this knowledge. And so they're constantly going to him, and he over time becomes less a prisoner and more an advisor to the king, and eventually, is able to corrupt them, their leadership pretty much entirely. So
he was playing the really, really long game.
Yeah, because he doesn't. He lives forever, so why not?
We've got a Harry Potter reference.
Yeah,
and also Star Wars.
Yeah, so he did, and that's part of why he left the ring behind, because, I don't think that he knew what was going to happen to Numenor, that it was going to be destroyed, but it allowed him to, even if the Numenors decided to execute him, that he would survive, because the ring was still in Mordor and he would live on, and then he would just be able to pick it back up because it's in Mordor,
I know this is a joke, but we were writing down potential guests for the show when it's actually, explain it to me when it's actually on. I did write Stephen Colbert down just to put that out into the universe and maybe manifest that.
That'd be so cool.
When we get closer to the show coming out, we'll put some feelers out. This channel will have exploded by then, and
sure. Yeah, Stephen will have to say yes.
Yeah, our army viewers can just tweet at Stephen Colbert and be like, "Please be on, explain it to me."
I did want to bring this up. I liked this question. How similar do you think this show, or how connected will it be to the movies?
I think it'll be fairly similar in tone. Like, if that picture is anything to go off of, it definitely kind of reminds me of the style of the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings.
And they filmed it in New Zealand and all that. So
yeah, so I think it would be weird of them not to, at least stylistically, hearken to the Peter Jackson movies. And there'll be things that lead into the stuff that happens in Lord of, like, Galadriel's story, if she is in fact in the show. The ancestors of Aragorn are certainly going to be involved. Also, the trees being in this prologue shot, so when the trees were destroyed, they actually took saplings, and like they planted trees that were descended from those trees in Numenor, which is where the White Tree of Gondor then comes from also, which is one of the things that Isildur and Elendil's group took with them from Numenor when they escaped before it was destroyed. So that is another thing that leads into Lord of the Rings, because the White Tree of Gondor ended up being, in the movies, and kind of a big deal.
How long before the last alliance of men and elves was the fall of Numenor?
Not very long, because like Elendil and Isildur are in the last alliance, and they fled Numenor basically right before it was destroyed. So it's not very long at all. And so like Gondor and Arnor, which is the northern kingdom that's gone by the time Lord of the Rings happens, those two kingdoms were also established during the Second Age. So, we could see some of that. We could see, what's the deal with Orthanc? Like, where did it come from? Like, the Numenorians built it. Like, all of that stuff happens during the Second Age. So
I've been under the assumption that they would be using basically the same production design. I assumed that this show would be in the same canon as the movies, but I don't know.
I guess that it's a different studio, so they can't literally say, like, this is the same universe as those movies were in,
right?
But it's based on the same canon and it's stylistically similar, so
It'll be interesting to see, yeah, like if Orthanc shows up, if it's like, yeah, that's Orthanc. It's the exact same tower, or if they change it up a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert on like how this sort of stuff, like licensing for these sorts of things, works. Whether that's some sort of copyright issue or not, I don't know. But we'll see.
It's probably another reason, like you said, Second Age is a good choice because they can.
Yeah.
What is Orthanc? You said it was a tower.
Isengard. It's where
Okay.
Sauron. It's Saruman's tower.
Yeah,
The big spiky one.
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I guess they're both pretty spiky, aren't
lot
they?
of-
Orthanc
lot
is
of
the
big
tower.
towers.
Isengard is like the whole complex.
Oh, okay, cool. A lot of big towers in Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be cool to see Gondor and like Minas Ithil actually be a
and it was
thing
Gilead before it was a
yeah.
ruin.
What is that? I know Minas Tirith.
So Minas Tirith is the big tiered city, and then Minas Ithil is also known as Minas Morgul, which is where Frodo and Sam go, and then they climb up the cliff, and there's the city that they see down below, and all the orcs and the ring wraiths come out of it.
Mm-hmm.
That used to be a city that humans lived in, and at this time it would still have been that. So during the Second Age, because when they built it, but then also as Gilead was actually the capital of Gondor, not Minas Tirith. So that would have been a big deal too. Also, we might get to see more stuff about the Palantirs, which is cool, because those were in Numenor. Because the elves, when Numenor was founded, the elves and the humans had a really good relationship, and the elves gave the humans those seeing stones so that they could communicate with the elves that were in the Undying Lands. Even though the humans couldn't go there, they could communicate back and forth with them.
That's nice.
with the seeing stones.
Those are the big bowling ball things that
yeah.
the hobbits take.
And there's one like really huge one that's like the Master Stone or whatever. I don't know. I can't remember what exactly they called it, but there was like one really big seeing stone also, which was taken to as Gilead after Numenor.
So Alex, bring the image back up for a second. Do we know anything about that city?
So that's Tyrion, on the hill. The hill is called Tuna, and that's a city that the elves lived in Valinor.
Okay.
At least, I mean, they haven't said that that's what it is, but it almost certainly is that.
Was it like in the light of the trees and all that, or?
Yeah, and geographically speaking, it was in a gap in the mountains, which was the only pass to get to the interior of Valinor, where the trees were. It was specifically put there because it was, that created a defensive point, and it was on a hill, and I guess the elves liked it. But yeah, that's probably what that is.
Okay. That's prime real estate right there.
Yeah, it's one of the. There's not a whole lot of like elven settlements that are named in the Silmarillion, but that's one of them, and that fits the bill for that city pretty well from what we can see in the pictures. So, I think that's almost certainly what it is.
Is there anything else in this image that we haven't talked about that you want to?
Not really. I mean, is there anything else that you had questions about?
Oh yeah, but while the image was up, I figured I'd ask.
No.
Okay. I was about to ask this, and Patrick also asked it. Do you think we're going to see dwarves in this at all, or is this going to be primarily elf, human, Sauron?
I mean, maybe. There's not a lot of storyline with the dwarves in the Second Age, really. Like they do a bunch of stuff in the First Age, and then they do a bunch of stuff in the Third Age, and before that they are pretty much just doing dwarf things under the mountains.
Wait, did you say Fourth Age?
No, doing dwarf things.
Oh, okay.
So dwarves are definitely around, right?
Yeah. I mean, they're around, and like if we do get a lot of story in like Gondor and Arnor, then it's very possible that we could see some dwarves, and they could be doing stuff, because like Moria would have been more active Well,
Yeah.
I don't know if Moria. I would have to look at the timeline to figure out if Moria would have already been destroyed at this point or not. I don't think so, though.
Are hobbits around?
I think so. There's a timeline for when hobbits first became like their own thing. But I think so. Yeah.
This is now where we're getting a bunch
I
of
want to see
questions
the,
like, yeah.
the Ent and Ent wives. We lost them. Where are they?
Yeah. Yeah, that would be cool. I think that the Ent wives had been separated from the Ents at this point already, though.
Oh no.
How about dragons?
Yeah, I mean there are definitely dragons around. Like the end of the first age, which is when Morgoth is defeated by the Valar, and he had just at that point unleashed the first winged dragons, which were gigantic and huge and powerful and a big deal. But ultimately, like one of them, the biggest one when it was killed, fell and broke a mountain because of where it fell. So it's kind of a big deal. They're like, they would have been really more powerful and more numerous at this point in time, but there's not a lot of, so there are some stories that involve dragons, but they're not what I'm anticipating is going to be in this show.
What is the War of Wrath?
So the War of Wrath is the war between Morgoth and the Valar. Well, the war between Morgoth and the Noldor specifically, that ends with the Valar coming in and beating him.
Hobbits fought in that war?
I think so, actually, because it says that like members of every race were part of that war on both sides, except for the elves, who only fought on the side of good.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So there were like dwarves and humans that fought with Morgoth.
You know what we need to do? We should rewatch the movies and do commentaries with Ashton, just like breaking down what's happening. Like, because there's so many times in the movies where they'll like cut to like a little mini history lesson, and it's like, what?
Speaking of dwarves and the War of Wrath, that just reminded me of something really cool from the Silmarillion, so I'm going to tell you about it.
This is what it's like to be friends with Ashton, by the way.
They talk about in the
that
War
reminded me of something, and I'm going to tell you about it.
That's why we're here.
I know.
There's a part in the War of Wrath where they talk about the dwarves actually being a big deal because they were one of the only forces that would stand and fight against the dragons. And they had like these metal like face shields that were just like really scary looking, and they would like scare off orcs just by like looking at them. And so they were relatively a little bit more protected from the dragon fire than most of the other forces, and so they'd actually like go and attack the dragons. Most people wouldn't. It's pretty cool, I thought.
I saw someone earlier in the chat ask if we would see dragons in this, and that would be cool, but it would also feel a little too Game of Thronesy.
Yeah, that's true. Well, it doesn't sound like this is going to be. Were there any big wars except for what kicks off and ends the Second Age? Like,
yeah, I was.
I'm wondering if this is going to be a very conflict-heavy show. I'm not expecting like Balrogs and stuff to be flying around fighting constantly.
Yeah, I was going to ask what the conflict was going to be.
So there's not like major wars per se, but there's a lot of humans that aren't in Numenor, and those humans are kind of, well, they're less civilized for the most part. Like they're or less advanced, I would say, than the Numenorians. And so the Numenorians, when they stay on Numenor for a while, and then all of a sudden they're like, hey, let's go back to Middle Earth and see what's going on. So they get in their boats and go back to Middle Earth. And they show up, and there's these people that are not as advanced as them. They don't live as long. They live like, a fourth the time that the Numenorians do in general. And so the Numenorians are seen as these like sea gods that show up every once in a while. And sometimes they are hostile to them. Sometimes they're not. And then those people are having wars with each other, like minor wars and things. So, I mean, there's all sorts of conflict. Also, we might see stuff that's not even in the Silmarillion, because in the Second Age, it talks a lot about how the mariners of the Numenorians were great explorers, and they couldn't go to the Undying Lands, but they could go wherever else they wanted. and there's like little mentions of them going to this place and that place that get name dropped in the Silmarillion and never explained. So, I mean, we could see stuff where it's like, oh, and this explorer went to, the Middle Earth equivalent of Australia that we have no information about, and who knows what he did there. They could just start making stuff up at that point.
All right. We got a super chat from Ulrika Skolman. Thank you so much. And I'll, before Ashton says anything, did you know that Elros, the first king of Numenor, is the brother of Elrond? I did know that. I'm going to try to say what I think the story behind him is, and you can tell me how right or wrong I am. So Elros and Elrond were given the chance to either stay elves or give up the... who calls it the gift? Is it men or is it elves? But Elros decided to become a man so he would die one day for some reason. And so that's where the Numenorians came from. I don't remember why they were given that choice, but is that vaguely correct at all?
Yeah. So basically, at the end of the... I'm getting everything mixed up in my head now. At the end of the first age, they were at the War of Wrath was going very poorly, because Morgoth all of a sudden decided, hey, you know what? I'm going to start trying. And he just starts like wiping everyone out. And so then this one important character named Arendil, who's a great mariner, decides that the only way that they'll survive is if the Valar actually help them. Because Morgoth is a Valar, none of them can stand against him without the good Valar's help. So he gets in a boat and he has one of the Silmarils, which is important, and he manages to actually navigate to the Undying Lands, which is supposed to be impossible at this point in time, but he does it. And he shows up in the Undying Lands knowing that they're supposed to be forbidden from going there because he has elven blood, but he is a human. Because up until this point, if you aren't actually like fully an elf, you're immortal. Amortal. So which means that he's banned from going to Valinor by the gods on pain of death. So he goes there anyway, and he's like, they might kill me just for going here, but I need to tell them that we need their help. And so he does it anyway, and he's like, this brave mission. And so he gets there, he talks to the Valar, he convinces them to come and help the people of Middle Earth, and they reward him for his courage and being a good guy by giving him a flying ship, which he uses to fight dragons during the end of the War of Wrath, which is really cool. And then after the War of Wrath is over, he actually goes up into the sky and takes the Silmaril with him, and that becomes a star, which is called Arendil, and it's the light of that star that Galadriel gives to Frodo in Lord of the Rings, bottled in a glass bottle.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up.
Yeah. So anyway, he has two sons, Elros and Elrond, and in addition to not killing him for going to the Undying Lands, the Valar also rewarded him by letting his children and their children decide whether they want to be, elves or if they want to choose a mortal life. Knowing that if they chose a mortal life, then they would be like kings and great, people of importance. So Elros chooses to be a king and be immortal.
But Elrond chose immortality, and he still got to basically be a king and a big important person. So he got the best of both worlds.
But when you think about it, Elrond, like everybody knows who Elrond is because of who his father was. But really, he's just another elf, and he's actually one of the younger elves at this point in time of importance. And like he goes back to Middle Earth and he starts kind of a city, but that's pretty much it for a long time. He became a herald of the High King of the Noldor later, like near the end of the Second Age, but for most of the Second Age, he was not really a big deal.
Okay.
So.
It's funny, just like being part of the audience. I'm like, I know Elrond's name far more than I can name than Elros.
Yeah. He became more of a big deal because people recognized that he was really wise, and they like sought counsel from him a lot. Which is part of why he was a herald of Gil-galad, who was like the High King of the Noldor. And then he ends up with one of the rings of power that Gil-galad carried before he was killed. So,
we've been going for almost an hour, but I have two more questions. One, what do you think this is going to be called? Because right now they're just calling it Lord of the Rings on Prime, and it's like, that's not the title.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a good one. I don't know.
I mean, it could just be the Second Age or Middle Earth, the Second Age or something like that.
Yeah, it'd be cool if like Middle Earth was part of the title.
Well, it'll be a little strange if that's the case because Numenor is not technically part of Middle Earth. Middle Earth is kind of like the mainland of Arda, which is the actual world. But maybe, I mean, who knows? Most of the story might be set in Middle Earth. We might not really see Numenor on screen that much. I'd be kind of surprised if that was the case, but it's possible.
Is Numenor kind of the central point for a lot of the Second Age stories?
Yeah, I mean, most of the stuff that happened, well, until it's destroyed, most of the stuff that happens in the Second Age is in Numenor. But, I mean, it might be set after Numenor's, technically, it might be set in the time period between when Numenor is destroyed and the end of the War of the Last Alliance. It's very unlikely because that's like the very, very tail end of the Second Age. But yeah, most of the stuff that happens in the Second Age is about Numenor.
I do like Stranger Rings quite a bit, but I mean, I think this is a good point that it could still have the Lord of the Rings subtitle because if it's about Sauron and the Rings of Power.
I mean, that's one thing that happens in Middle Earth is Celebrimbor creates the Rings of Power with Sauron's influence.
So yeah, they could just call it like Lord of the Rings, the Second Age or something like that.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, in order to market it, they want to make sure people know kind of what world this is taking place in. Like, hey, remember those Lord of the Rings movies? Here's a show.
Mm-hmm. The other question I had is, are you at all worried that you know too much for this show? That like there won't be any surprises?
Nah.
And you're gonna okay.
I'm mostly like any sense of being like let down because I'm not surprised by things is going to be vastly outweighed by giddiness of seeing things on screen that I've read about like so many times.
Yep, you freaked out over a couple trees, so I think that's probably true.
A couple of trees. Those are trees with capital T.
Capital T trees.
Yeah.
That's going back to almost a week ago now. Ashton sent me a message that says, "Holy shit, the trees!" And you did write them with a capital T.
Yeah.
Well, those are all the questions I have for now. We'll, I'm sure, talk more about this as it comes up whenever they give us a trailer. I mean, it doesn't come out for another 13 months, but
well, I bet they're gonna more about what they're actually setting in the show. I mean, maybe it's not going to be mostly the Second Age. I mean, I don't think that they've have they specifically said that somewhere.
I guess I thought so. But I don't know for sure. I've just seen that thrown around enough that it was stuck in my head.
Yeah.
But I'll see if I can figure out.
Yeah. I mean, who knows? I think
yeah. Okay. So August 3rd, Lord of the Rings on Prime tweeted, "That's a wrap. Thank you to our amazing cast and crew and to New Zealand for being the incredible place we have been privileged to call home as we bring the Second Age and Middle Earth to life." Okay,
cool. Yeah. I mean, also, if they said it in the First Age, almost all the characters in it would be elves. And I think that they probably like telling stories where most of the characters are humans more, just because for most people, it's like that's easier to connect with that story. So, yeah. But hopefully we'll get some fun flashback scenes or a prologue or something that shows some of the cool stuff that happens in the first or prior age.
Well, we got one more super chat from Rick Villanueva again. Thanks, Rick. Do you think it'll largely be an original story?
Probably. You know, I mean, like I was saying before, like we have, like there's a lot of stuff that happens in the Second Age, but it's mostly just things from the Silmarillion. And for people that have read the Silmarillion, you know that most of the information in the Silmarillion is very succinct and concise, and it's like so and so did this thing, and then now moving on to the next thing that happened. It's not told as like a storytelling story, and so there's a lot of details that are lost there. So even if they do actually tell the story of something that is mentioned in the Silmarillion, it's going to largely be original storytelling because there's that level of detail just isn't present in the Silmarillion's telling of it. If that makes sense at all.
Yeah. How do you feel about that? That someone is like kind of stepping into Tolkien's world and making some stuff up?
I mean, I think it's exciting. Like, you know, that's something that we've talked about before with like the difference between Lord of the Rings and Star Wars is that Star Wars has like all these creators that are creating stuff for it constantly. And there's like all these books and things. And Lord of the Rings still basically just has like under 10 books, really, you know? So I'm kind of excited to see someone actually get to step into that world and create something new.
Yeah, it's kind of like whenever we hear about new Star Wars projects that are by people that we know, like when Taika got announced that he was doing a Star Wars movie, like we like all his other stuff. So it's really exciting to see him get to play in the Star Wars sandbox. So,
and I mean,
that being said, I did complain earlier about the War of the Ring video games because but those don't make any sense. So as long as they actually as long as they make it actually fit with the world and it makes sense, then I'm going to be thrilled. If they're just like, who cares? And they just like have Aragorn, you know, you can't call him Aragorn, call him something else, but have him be Aragorn, and he talks to a ghost elf and makes himself a ring of power. Why not? Like, as long as they don't like do that kind of stuff, I'm gonna be.
Is that what happens in that video game?
Basically,
I've only played Shadow of Mordor. I haven't played the sequel. Maybe so. That's something we can do in between now and then. Also, and I was going to bring this up. We've got that War of the Rohirrim animated film coming too.
Oh yeah, that'll be really cool.
I don't know when that comes out, but yeah, we've got some other Lord of the Rings stuff to look forward to.
The Rohirrim are my favorite, so I'm excited about that.
Yeah. Well, Molly's AirPods died right at the end. Well, Ashton, thanks for joining us on our first of many Lord of the Rings discussions. Where can people find you and follow you online?
So I'm on Twitter and on Twitch at Yeti Boatman. I play video games on there every once in a while, so that's pretty much it.
You should play that game and just yell about it the whole time.
I did buy it on Steam when it was on sale, specifically because I knew that you would want me to play it on Twitch at some point because it'll make me so upset.
My stupid AirPods died right at the end.
Well, Molly, where can people follow you online?
You can find me at Molly Damon on Twitter and Star Wars Explained. And if you're a fan of the Schmodown, you can find me on A Certain Point of View.
And yeah, I think we'll be back where we've got a Lego stream this Wednesday. We've got our last episode of the Clone Zone for the Bad Batch on Friday. So that's our streaming schedule for this week. But thank you all for hanging out with us tonight and talking Lord of the Rings. And we'll see you next time.